أنا دكتور خالد وليد، ربان سفينة النجاة إلى شواطئ بكة القدس. I am Dr. Khaled Waleed, the captain of the ship of salvation to the shores of Baka, Jerusalem.
Welcome to The Deep Dive. We're all about getting to the heart of really interesting stuff. And today we're going to be looking at this text called The Evil Tree and the Good Tree.
Okay.
And it's really interesting. It has a very unusual perspective on Islamic scripture. And some of the stuff in there is going to be pretty surprising.
Yeah, it's definitely...
So strap yourselves in.
It's not what you'd expect.
Yeah, this is one of those deep dives where like some of your assumptions about like biblical figures and stories, especially around this concept of chosen people, might get completely flipped on their heads. So
yeah, particularly, I think the author really zeroes in on this idea of like key verses.
Oh, interesting.
These are like specific verses that they argue unlock a lot of these hidden meanings in the Quran.
So like they're saying that there are like these secret decoder rings within the Quran that you have to use to really understand what it's saying.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And one of the big claims they make using this kind of framework is that this whole idea of the Israelites being God's chosen people, like that's been accepted for over 1,300 years.
Yeah.
It might actually be a complete misunderstanding.
Okay, that's a huge claim. So how do they even start to unpack that?
Well, they start by looking at some major figures, starting with Adam.
Okay.
Now, most people think of Adam as like, you know, just the first human.
Right.
But this text presents him as like this kind of warrior figure sent by God.
A warrior?
Yeah, to fight against corruption that's already happening on Earth.
Hold on, wait. So if Adam is being sent to fight corruption, who's he fighting? Like, is this before Eve? What's going on?
That's where things get really wild. The text actually suggests that this pre-existing corruption is coming from the Israelites who are already on Earth before Adam even shows up.
Whoa.
They even say that when the angels in the Quran are worried about humans causing bloodshed, they're not talking about Adam and his descendants at all. They're talking about the Israelites.
Wow. Okay, so that completely changes how you read that story.
Oh, yeah.
So if Adam is this warrior battling corruption, where does that leave someone like Israel? I mean, the whole story's named after him, right?
Exactly. And that's where the text takes another big swing.
Okay.
They actually question whether Israel even refers to Jacob the patriarch at all. They point to verses where the name Israel appears before Jacob is given that name.
Right.
And even after he's dead.
Oh, wow.
So they propose that Israel might be something else entirely.
So who are they saying Israel is?
This is going to sound crazy, but they connect Israel to the fallen angel described in Surah Al-Araf.
Okay.
You know, the chapter in the Quran.
Yeah. And just for context for our listeners, the idea of fallen angels is central to Islamic theology.
Absolutely. And this particular surah tells the story of this being who's super blessed by God, could even be a prophet.
Right.
But rejects God's grace and decides to follow Satan instead.
So is this text saying that Israel is this fallen angel?
That's exactly what they're saying. They argue that this incredibly powerful being, this close confidant of God, essentially makes this terrible choice.
Yeah.
And becomes the ultimate source of all this corruption.
Okay, this is definitely not what I learned in Sunday school, so I have a feeling this is where the title of the text comes in, right?
Yeah.
The evil tree and the good tree.
You got it.
Okay.
This metaphor is central to their whole argument.
Okay.
So the evil tree represents the Israelites.
Right.
They're portrayed as like deeply rooted in this corruption, actively working against God.
Okay.
And then Adam and his descendants are the good tree.
So they're the good guys.
Yeah, they're trying to be righteous,
Okay.
but they're stuck in a world that's already been tainted by this fallen angel's influence.
So according to this text, it's not just that some people made bad choices. There's like this active force of evil out there, embodied by this Israel figure.
Right.
And battling against the forces of good, which Adam represents.
Yeah, it's like a cosmic showdown.
That's insane. So it totally changes this whole idea of chosen versus unchosen.
Right.
Instead of the Israelites being favored by God,
Right.
they're like the originators of all the bad stuff.
Yeah, according to this text, they're spreading corruption even before Adam and Eve show up.
Wow, I can definitely see why this is ruffling some feathers.
Yeah, it's a very different way of looking at things.
This is like a complete reimagining of some of the most basic stories in religious history.
Absolutely. And to really understand how they get there, we need to look closer at how they portray the Israelites.
Yeah, let's do it. I want to see how this whole evil tree metaphor plays out and how it changes the way we think about Adam and Eve and even the idea of original sin.
Let's get into it.
Okay. You know what really gets me about this whole evil tree metaphor? It's like they're saying corruption isn't just about making the wrong choice. It's like this active force, almost like a disease, you know?
Yeah, and they argue that the Israelites aren't just vulnerable to it, they're like the source of it, spreading it everywhere long before Adam even shows up.
Right, like patient zero for corruption.
Exactly, and it really throws a wrench into the whole Adam and Eve story, don't you think?
Absolutely. I mean, we're always taught that they're the ones who brought sin and corruption into the world by eating the forbidden fruit.
Right, but here corruption is already pre-existing condition.
Yeah, like it was always lurking in the background.
So if we follow this text's logic, Adam and Eve's story takes on a whole new meaning. Instead of being the origin of sin, it becomes about humanity's struggle against this evil that's already taken root.
So instead of being the first sinners, they become the first warriors against this, like, evil force.
Exactly. It really flips the script.
It really does make you wonder about the whole nature of good and evil, then, right? Like, if corruption predates humanity, where did it come from?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like, why would a loving God allow suffering and evil to exist?
Right. It's that age-old problem of evil that philosophers and theologians have been wrestling with forever.
Exactly. And this text doesn't try to shy away from it at all.
It really does head first into these huge questions, right? Offers a very different perspective on how these forces of good and evil might be playing out on like a cosmic scale.
And it's interesting because even though it's drawing from Islamic scripture, these themes are universal. You know, the idea of this battle between good and evil.
Yeah, it's like every story ever told, right? It's in our myths, our legends, even our own lives.
It's that constant struggle we all face, trying to make sense of the world and the choices we make.
For sure. And what I think is so interesting is that this text uses specific verses from the Quran to make its case. It's not just some abstract philosophy.
It's grounded in the actual text.
It's like they're saying, hey, don't just take our word for it. Go back to the source and see for yourself.
It's a really interesting approach, especially today when we're constantly bombarded with information.
Yeah, totally. So if we buy into this idea that the Israelites aren't God's chosen people, but are actually tied to this pre-existing corruption, how does that change our understanding of some of the key stories in the Quran?
Well, let's take the story of the Israelites asking for a king, for example.
Okay, yeah, that's in Surah al-Baqarah, right?
That's right. And the traditional understanding is that they wanted a leader to guide them in battle.
Right, they needed someone to rally behind.
Exactly. But this text argues that they weren't just asking for any king, they were asking for a specific individual who embodied their corrupt nature.
Okay, and who was this individual?
Remember that fallen angel we talked about, Israel?
Yeah.
They're suggesting that the Israelites were essentially asking for this fallen angel to rule over them.
Wow, so they're not seeking guidance and protection, they're inviting the source of corruption to lead them.
That's the implication. And it really emphasizes that idea that the Israelites, as portrayed by this text, aren't just misguided, they're actively embracing this destructive force.
And the text also points to other examples too, right? Like the verses about the Israelites killing prophets and rejecting messages from God.
Yeah, they use those as further proof of this inherent corruption.
It's a pretty harsh picture.
Definitely. And it raises a tough question. If they're this entangled with corruption, is there any hope for redemption? Can they ever escape this evil tree?
That's a question I don't think the text really answers.
No, it focuses mostly on the nature and origins of this corruption.
Right.
But it leaves the question of redemption open for us to think about, you know, to wrestle with the implications of this whole new perspective and figure out what we believe about the possibility of change.
It's a lot to unpack.
Definitely. But it really gets you thinking about these stories in a whole new way.
That's what the deep dive is all about, right? Exploring those unconventional ideas, challenging the way we think.
Absolutely. We're not afraid to get into the weeds and spark some interesting conversations.
We're not here to give you all the answers, but to give you the tools to ask better questions.
And dig a little deeper.
So as we wrap up our look at this text, we want to hear from you, our listeners. What are your thoughts on all this?
What stood out to you as the most impactful or challenging idea we've talked about in this deep dive?
Honestly, for me, it's that whole chosen people thing getting completely flipped around. I mean, to say that the Israelites aren't the chosen ones, but are actually the source of all the bad stuff.
Yeah.
It's crazy. Makes you question everything.
It really does make you wonder how many other interpretations are out there, you know? Like how many ways we could be reading these stories and completely missing the point.
It really does. And that metaphor of the two trees, the evil tree and the good tree, it's just stuck with me. It's such a powerful way to picture the whole conflict.
It's a good illustration of how, even within the same faith tradition, you can have such different interpretations.
For sure. And I think that's a really important thing to remember, no matter what your beliefs are, that there's rarely just one right way to understand these complex texts, especially religious ones.
Right, especially with something like the Quran that's been interpreted and reinterpreted for centuries.
Exactly. This is where critical thinking comes in, right? We have to engage with these texts, ask the tough questions, not just accept what we're told.
It's about being an active participant in finding meaning, not just a passive recipient.
It's like this text is inviting us to have a conversation about these ideas, not just laying down the law.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so exciting.
So I have to ask, after going through all of this and exploring this idea of Israel as a fallen angel and the source of corruption, does it change the way you see those foundational stories like Adam and Eve, the whole concept of original sin?
It definitely adds another layer to it.
Mm-hmm.
It makes you rethink those ideas like free will, the origins of evil, what our role is in all this.
It's heavy stuff, but that's the beauty of these deep dives, right?
Absolutely.
It's not about easy answers. It's about opening our minds to new possibilities.
It's about asking better questions.
Mm-hmm. So to all our listeners out there, we'll leave you with this. If corruption isn't something that started with humans, but is something we inherited, something we're born into, how does that change your view of your place in the world? What does it mean to fight against that corruption, not just out there, but inside yourself? These are big questions, and we hope you keep exploring them.
Happy dive it, everyone.
And until next time, folks, keep questioning, keep exploring, keep diving deep.
أنا دكتور خالد وليد ربان سفينة النجاة إلى شواطئ بكة القدس. I am Dr. Khaled Waleed, the captain of the ship of salvation to the shores of Baka, Jerusalem.